Right now, at this exact moment as you're watching this video, something is happening inside the technology industry whose scale, whose speed, and whose implications. The mainstream technology press has been criminally underreporting as the background story whose significance the quarterly earnings report, the product launch event, and the executive drama occupy the foreground attention at the cost of the story, whose consequence for a very person who owns a computer, works in an office, drives a car, uses a smartphone, or depends on the digital infrastructure whose operation the connected economy requires. As the daily foundation is the story that makes every other TechnoLY story the sideshow rather than the main event. Microsoft lost $40 billion in market value in a single trading week. Dell just announced the largest Linux hardware commitment in the company's history. The German government declared Windows a national security risk. China completed the migration of 50 million Windows. The United States military quietly replaced the Windows installation on classified systems with a Linux variant whose existence the public disclosure did not announce as the press release, but whose procurement records, the defense spending transparency requirements, revealed as the documented transition. And in the last 90-day alone, more Fortune 500 companies have begun the enterprise Linux migration than in the preceding 5 years combined. Something big is happening with Linux, not the gradual, incremental background progress whose slow accumulation the technology commentary has been documenting as the Linux story's characteristic pace. Something whose velocity, whose institutional scale, and whose geopolitical dimension together constitute the inflection point, whose arrival the accumulated evidence is announcing as the current moment rather than the projected future. Patches, whose application is the remediation response that the Linux security community's rapid response to disclosed vulnerabilities typically produces, and to bypass the security tools whose deployment on Linux systems has been the security posture whose Suffix INC, the prior threat landscape's character, had made reasonable to assume, targeting specifically the developers. Something is happening inside Microsoft's engineering infrastructure that the company has not been announcing with the prominence that its significance deserves, and that the community is most directly affected by it. The Windows users, who have been migrating to Linux in the numbers this series has documented, the enterprise architects who have been managing dual platform deployments whose complexity the migration wave created, and the Linux advocates whose decade-long argument that the two platforms could coexist productively was dismissed as ideological wishful thinking by the Windows-centric commercial computing establishment, are only now beginning to understand in the full scope of what it means for where personal and enterprise computing is actually heading, rather than where the promotional narratives of either platform's advocates would have it go. Something is happening inside Microsoft's engineering infrastructure that the company has not been announcing with the prominence that its significance deserves, and that the community is most directly affected by it. The Windows users who have been migrating to Linux in the numbers this series has documented, the enterprise architects who have been managing dual platform deployments whose complexity the migration wave created, and the Linux advocates whose decade-long argument that the two platforms could coexist productively was dismissed as ideological wishful thinking by the Windows-centric commercial computing establishment are only now beginning to understand in the full scope of what it means for where personal and enterprise computing is actually heading, rather than where the promotional narratives of either platform's advocates would have it go. Microsoft is making Windows and Linux work together, not in the limited, developer-focused sense that the Windows subsystem for Linux created years ago, which gave Windows users a terminal window running Linux commands within a Windows environment, and whose practical value was genuine for developers, while its symbolic value as an indicator of genuine platform integration philosophy was limited by its clear framing as a Windows-serving tool rather than a genuine collaborative architecture. Not in the marketing speak sense of interoperability that technology companies invoke when they want credit for platform openness without delivering the architectural changes that genuine openness requires. In the specific, technically documented, organizationally committed, and commercially motivated sense, that means Microsoft's engineers are building shared infrastructure, compatible deployment architectures, and unified management tooling whose net effect is erasing the hard boundary between Windows and Linux systems at the enterprise layer where most of the computing that matters commercially actually runs. The secrecy in the title is not the secrecy of a classified program whose existence is unknown outside cleared personnel. It is the secrecy of an organizational strategy, whose implications are significant enough that the communications decisions about how and when to announce it have been made with a specific care that accompanies announcements whose reception by different audience segments is complicated enough to require managing the framing rather than releasing the information and allowing the framing to emerge organically from the reception. Microsoft is not hiding the technical work. The technical work is documented in e-engineering blogs, GitHub repositories, conference presentations, and developer documentation, whose audience is the technical community that implements, rather than the general audience that forms impressions. What is being managed is the organizational narrative, the story about what the work means strategically, commercially, and competitively, whose construction requires more deliberate architecture than the engineering work itself. Here is exactly what Microsoft is building at the technical layer that is making Windows and Linux work together in ways that prior platform boundaries prevented. Here is why Microsoft is doing them, is now rather than earlier or later, and what the specific combination of competitive pressures, enterprise customer demands, cloud infrastructure realities, and regulatory environment is producing the strategic motivation that is funding an engineering program whose implications for both platforms are more profound than either platform's advocacy communities have yet fully processed. Here is what the architecture that is emerging from this engineering program will mean for Windows users whose computing experience will be shaped by the integrated platform rather than by the separate Windows experience that prior releases delivered. Here is what it means for Linux users and the LinUX community whose growth this series has been documenting and supporting, and whose relationship with Microsoft has historically been defined by the adversarial dynamic that the current convergence is replacing. Here is what the enterprise implications are for organizations whose SE infrastructure decisions are being made in the context of a platform boundary, whose dissolution changes the decision calculus that prior planning operated within. Here is what the privacy implications are for the users on both sides of the converging platform. Boundary, because convergence that brings Windows' commercial surveillance architecture into contact with Linux's privacy-respecting architecture produces outcomes whose character depends entirely on which platform's architectural philosophy the convergence adopts rather than the other. And here is the honest assessment of whether the convergence Microsoft is building represents the genuine openness that Linux advocates have argued Microsoft should embrace for 2 decades, or the commercial capture of Linux growing enterprise relevance that the same advocates have warned was the inevitable endpoint of Microsoft's engagement with open source. There is an intelligence agency operating out of Kiev, whose emblem is an owl plunging a sword into Russia. Its motto, written in Latin, translates to, "The wise will rule over the stars." The Russians know this agency. They have been studying it, hunting its operatives, arresting its assets, and attempting to dismantle its networks inside Russian territory since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. And yet, in the 12 months between December 2024 and February 2026, this agency, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the HUR, WUMA, walked into the heart of Moscow, the most surveilled city on the European continent, and did something that no foreign intelligence service had managed to do in the entire history of the modern Russian state. It killed or gravely wounded 3 of Russia's most senior military generals in their own capital, in their own neighborhoods. On streets they walked every single morning on the way to offices, whose addresses the FSB had kept classified for decades. The first general died on December 17, 2024, killed by a bomb hidden on an electric scooter outside his apartment building. The second died on April 25, 2025, killed by an explosive device packed with shrapnel that had been planted in his car in a Moscow suburb. The third was gunned down on February 6, 2026, by a shooter disguised as a food delivery courier who had entered his apartment building, waited in the stairwell, and put 3 bullets into one of Russia's most decorated intelligence officers as he left for work. The FSB opened criminal investigations each time. Vladimir Putin was personally briefed each time, and each time, the Kremlin's best answer to a country that had managed to assassinate generals inside Russia's most heavily protected city was to look at the cameras, point at Kiev, and admit, without saying it directly, that Russia's security services had failed in a way that had no precedent in the post-Soviet era. Nobody in Moscow can explain how Ukraine keeps doing it, and that inability to explain is itself the most frightening military fact of the war. Before the names, before the car bombs, before the stairwell shooting and the scooter bomb, and the shrapnel-packed device that Russia's investigative committee described with the specific clinical language of professionals processing a catastrophe they cannot stop. Before all of it, understand what the HUR is and what it is not, because the organization that is systematically eliminating Russia's senior military command structure is not what most people imagine when they picture a wartime intelligence agency. The HUR, Holovnye Upravlenia Razvidki, the main directorate of intelligence of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, was established in 1992 from the existing intelligence assets of Soviet military districts when Ukraine became independent. For most of the 30 years between independence and the full-scale invasion, it was a competent but unremarkable military intelligence service operating in the shadow of larger organizations. It gathered signals, intelligence, It ran agents, it produced assessments, it did what military intelligence services do in peacetime, which is to say it was useful and invisible. February 24th, 2022, changed it into something else, something that does not have a clean historical parallel, because no intelligence service in modern history has conducted offensive operations at this scale, with this consistency, against a AENA. You clear armed adversaries' senior military leadership inside that adversary's own territory. The HUR, under Lieutenant General Kirilo Budanov, who served until January 2nd, 2026, and whose tenure produced the operational framework that is now executing the assassinations, transformed from a defensive intelligence gatherer into what its own annual report describes as an architect of a new model of warfare. The owl on the emblem is not decorative, it is a threat. And the sword it is plunging into Russia is real, made of real explosive charges and real bullets. And it has been finding real targets in the city whose skyline Putin uses as the backdrop for his claims of invincibility. The first killing in this specific sequence began at approximately 8 in the morning in southeastern Moscow, in a residential area that Russian security planners had assessed as secure enough for one of their most senior military figures to live without enhanced protection. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov walked out of his apartment building on December 17th, 2024. He was the head of Russia's radiological, chemical, and biological defense forces, the officer personally responsible for the military units that handled nuclear, biological, and chemical threats, and the man whom Ukrainian prosecutors had charged in absentia the day before his death with committing war crimes through the deployment of chemical weapons against Ukrainian forces. He never made it to his car. An explosive device had been hidden inside a scooter parked near the building's entrance. When Kirillov and his assisto Ant emerged, the device detonated. Both men died. Ukraine's SBU security service claimed responsibility immediately. A source within the SBU told journalists that Kirillov was a war criminal and a perfectly legitimate target, and that such a disgraceful end await as all those who kill Ukrainians. The message was not subtle because it was not designed to be. It was designed to be read by every other Russian general on Ukraine's list and understood for exactly what it was: a notification of intent. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that America's most trusted ally in the Middle East, the country that has bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American weapons, the country that built its entire military around F-15s and Patriot missiles and Abrams tanks, has quietly, systematically, and deliberately begun replacing all of it with Chinese technology. Not because they had to, because they chose to. And the moment you understand why they made that choice, you will never look at the Middle East, American foreign policy, or global military power the same way again. Stay with me, because what unfolds over the next few minutes is not just a story about weapons. It is a story about trust, about survival, about a seismic shift in global power that is happening right now, in real time. And most people have absolutely no idea it is even occurring. For nearly 8 decades, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States was built on one of the most elegant and profitable deals in modern geopolitical history. Saudi Arabia sits on top of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. The United States, for decades, needed that oil to fuel its economy, its military, and its global dominance. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia sells oil in US dollars, keeps those dollars flowing through American banks and American financial systems, and in return, the United States provides the ultimate security guarantee. American troops stationed on Saudi soil, American weapons filling Saudi arsenals, the American nuclear umbrella extending over the entire Arabian Peninsula. It was called the petrodollar system, and for 50 years, it was the invisible backbone of American power in the world. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth was a small vote of confidence. In the American dollar and American military supremacy, the system was beautiful in its simplicity, and then it started to crack. The cracks did not appear overnight. They appeared slowly, over years, through a series of events that each on their own seemed manageable, but together told a devastating story about the limits of American commitment to its Gulf partners. Think back to September 2019. Iranian drones and cruise missiles launched a devastating strike on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, the single most important piece of energy infrastructure on the planet, processing roughly 5% of the world's daily oil supply. The facility was engulfed in fire. Satellite images showed massive destruction. And the world watched to see what America would do. President Trump's response was careful, measured, and deeply unsatisfying to Riyadh. He said America was locked and loaded, and then he did essentially nothing militarily.